A very warm welcome, everybody, to today's Pretoria-Marburg Queer Conversations. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to have you all here. This is the third session of the Pretoria-Marburg Queer Conversations, where we facilitate discussions between scholars and activists on LGBTIQ+ lived realities in Africa. My name is Mariel Rice. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Center for Conflict Studies and affiliated with the Center for Gender Studies and Feminist Futures, both at the University of Marburg in Germany. And I'm very happy that also my co-hosts of the sessions are here, Dr. Justice Matsani and Dr. Ayo Suguro, and as well as our other team members, Andini Hassana and Thiruna. And I just want to say briefly that we have, during the past two sessions, which you can both watch on our the YouTube channel of the Center for Human Rights, in case you've missed it, we've discussed queering coming out, nuances among individuals in South Africa, and threats to human rights for LGBTIQ+ communities, focusing on hate crimes and conversion therapy. And today we will actually pick up some of the aspects already mentioned in these sessions. So they all are woven together to some extent. I have now the great pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. Monica Tabangwa is a lawyer and human rights advocate from Botswana. She started her career as a prosecutor with Botswana Police and then joined the women's rights sector, where she provided legal assistance to women and children. Subsequently, she left Botswana and joined the Coalition of African Lesbians as advocacy advisor doing regional and international advocacy work on LGBTIQ+ rights. She has also worked for Pan-African ILGA, Human Rights Watch, and HIVOS, and is now with UNDP as a policy specialist in the Inclusive Governance Initiative. Monica holds an LLM from the University of Pretoria. She's also a member of the drafting committee and a signatory of the Jakarta Principles +10. She has published on violence and discrimination against LGBTIQ+ persons in different African states. And I'm absolutely happy I could engage her for today's discussion. Thank you so much, Monica, for joining us. Our second panelist for today is Dr. Adrian Juko. He is a Ugandan human rights lawyer and advocate. He's the executive director of the Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum, which provides legal aid services to LGBTIQ+ persons and engages the police and the judiciary on LGBTIQ+ rights within a largely hostile legal environment. He was the coordinator of the Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights and Constitutional Law, Uganda, the coalition that led the challenge to the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda. It won the the US State Department's Human Rights Defender of the Year Award 2011 during his tenure. Adrian earned his LLD at the University of Pretoria and has published on strategic litigation for LGBTIQ+ rights in several African countries. Just to mention one particular publication, which is called Envisioning Global LGBT Human Rights, Neo-Colonialism, Neoliberalism, Resistance and Hope. This was published in 2018, an amazing volume, which is actually available open access and that I can highly recommend to everybody here. Both of them, and I'm also very, very happy that Adrian has agreed to join us. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to have you both here. And they are both at the forefronts of the legal and societal battles to decriminalize same-sex sexual behavior and other discriminating laws, inter alia, from the colonial era. I'm very, very happy. I can just say it again and again that they have agreed to be part of this event series. And without further ado, I just want to jump into the topic and discussion for today, the colonial legacies of anti-LGBTIQ+ rights in African states. In the past years, we've seen debates and court cases in various African countries around the criminalization and decriminalization of same-sex sexual conduct between consenting adults. many of the laws which criminalize same-sex activities, usually between men, are based on British Commonwealth law or Dutch Roman law. These laws carry a very obvious colonial imprint. They have for a long time been and are still part of many constitutions and penal codes across Africa. Apart from these laws, there are discriminatory practices that are related and make it difficult for NGOs and activists to carry out their work, such as the registration of NGOs that work on LGBTIQ+ issues. Then there are so-called cross-dressing laws as well as challenges for trans persons inter alia to change their gender marker officially. And a newer trend, which goes further than the laws based on colonial laws, and which Monica and Adrian have written a chapter on in the edited volume I just mentioned, called Expanded Criminalization of Consensual Same-Sex Relations in Africa. In the chapter, they discuss expanded criminalization, where the wording and definitions are changed from the previous carnal knowledge and sodomy to actually naming homosexuality and something like promoting homosexuality, and which introduce even harsher punishment for same-sex conduct. More recently, we also see the influx of right-wing and or US American evangelicals, oh my God, I never pronounce this word, who support and export anti-LGBTIQ+ legislation and who see African states literally as virgin ground or ground zero for their anti-LGBTIQ+ agenda. Apart from these mostly legal implications, discriminatory practices also have colonial legacies, such as othering and the practices of discriminating against persons which are non-cis and non-hetero or are perceived as such. Today, we want to discuss the lasting impact of these colonial legacies on current debates and legal battles across the continent, the challenges which these entangled discriminatory practices impose on LGBTIQ+ persons until today, and how they are still implemented, and hopefully also some practices to oppose and overcome them. I have asked both of our panelists to prepare an introductory statement or answer to a question based on their wide-reaching expertise, and would like Monica to get us started by answering the following question. From your experience as an activist and advocate concerning LGBTIQ+ rights in various African states, which aspects of colonial legacies of anti-LGBTIQ+ rights are the most pressing today? And with that, I will just hand over to you, Monica.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam, and thank you for the organizers, UP, and your university for the support. Adrian, hello. It's always great to share a podium with you. I've worked with Adrian on many occasions, and him and I enjoy arguing, friendly arguments. So this is a good way to agree for once. Anyway, just to come back to the question. I was introduced as being from Botswana, and the reason why I raised it is the fact that Botswana just recently, last year in fact, decriminalized same-sex conduct through a famous Court of Appeal judgment. And one of the things that the judges reiterated was the fact that these were colonial laws that had been imported into the country that came with colonization way back when the British were doing what they were doing. And so and basically suggesting that before that, African culture, Botswana culture at least, was fluid enough and tolerant enough to accept and not penalize people's sexual behavior or gender identities. And so when this came and they somehow managed to get into constitutions, into penal codes, became coded as laws that basically, outlawed sexual behavior that was considered to be unnatural and against the order of nature, as it's written. And the other thing that came with colonization was fundamentalist Christian views on that kind of brought an intolerance towards sexuality, right? And so a combination of these laws and the Christian dogma together, and through time, I mean, colonization happened a long time ago, and these were entrenched into constitutions in the 60s when we became independent, and maintained throughout, even after independence. And so with time, this kind of intolerance kind of crystallized into what we believe today is culture. Because when you hear our politicians talk today, and they talk about homosexuality is un-African, is against our culture. And yet we know, and we've seen that African culture did not give a damn about one's sexuality. And really it was more fluid and tolerant, and nobody really had to be penalized in the way that we see penalization today. And so it has crystallized into custom so much that people actually today, we believe it is our culture instead of a Western import, or rather an import that came with colonization. And so, that's really how this happened. And the sad thing is, many of these countries, in Africa, for instance, we have about 30, just over 30 countries criminalizing same-sex conduct. And most of these are Commonwealth countries, which means they are British colonies. And many of them don't even enforce it, which actually supports this view that this was never really part of who we are as Africans. But I think because of the relationship, the whole connotation around, or the whole perception of what colonization is, and the belief that we must reject everything that appears to be colonization. Now the removal of those laws seem to be coming from the West again. It's been rejected, right? So there is a double contrast there, in the sense that even though it came with the West, now we believe it so much that it's ours. And then we have people saying we must decriminalize, we must remove these laws. But the anti-colonization sentiment feels like now what is coming from the West is homosexuals, people saying we must accept homosexuality. And so that is it's making sure that this colonial legacy of criminalization is maintained throughout these 30 odd countries in Africa. And so the Christian fundamentalism, what it does is also just really make this even more strong in terms of the opposition to decriminalization. And now it's not just coming from the English, it's everywhere. And you have American evangelists, bringing in even more money into Africa to support these very conservative values around family, around tradition, around culture, that basically, supports the binaries, and does not agree that we can be fluid and we can have various kind of families. As we know that in Africa, in my own country, for instance, you cannot say a family is a man, his wife, and kids. That's just, you will leave out 75% of the population, because there is such a diversity that a very narrow definition of family cannot work. And so all of these, the fundamentalism that's coming with anti-LGBTI sentiments is really entrenching even more the intolerance that was brought about by colonization. And so for me, I think criminalization is one of the biggest legacies that has really been damaging to Africans. We've seen, the independent expert on, the UN independent expert reports, he does periodic reports, and one of the reports laments to the fact that criminalization of same-sex conduct, even in countries where it's not enforced, it breeds other forms of human rights abuse. You see people being denied certain rights that they are normally entitled to. You talked about registration, for instance. There is nothing in any of the many constitutions that says you can't be registered because you are registering an LGBTI organization. But because of that criminalization, whenever NGOs apply for registration or legal recognition, people always refer back to that criminalization because, of course, the intolerance is there. It's already believed that, if these people cannot be allowed to exist or coexist and be, have access all the rights, registration is one of them. And we've seen in many countries, people being denied registration. Legacies, which is in Botswana, was denied registration for a long time, and they had to go to court to enforce the right to freedom of association. And this is happening across many countries. Again, what you see is a denial of rights, such as the right to health, the right to education, just the right to be whole as a citizen. When people say that I need to be able to change my identity or change my documents to reflect who I believe to be, who I am. And those rights are denied on the basis of, that colonial legacy, which is the criminalization. And so you see it just really, the effect of the criminalization just expanding into a whole sector of denial for LGBTI persons. And then in other countries, especially when it's combined with consistent and regular religious organizing or opposition, you see countries now seeking to even expand the criminalization. For example, Ghana is dealing with an issue right now where Ghana is already criminalizing same-sex conduct based on that colonial legacy from the British. But at this point right now, they are trying to expand the criminalization to include many other aspects, just really to deny even more rights for LGBTI persons. You see persons and their families, their organizations, and their allies, just that they should not ever exist or be seen in the country. And so for me, I think there's that. Just last thing, maybe before I stop, is, in addition, there are other ways that, the colonization has come in. There are other smaller ways of ensuring that, sexuality is controlled, or just gender identity. And there are small ways of controlling this. There are laws on prostitution or sex work, for instance. Laws on loitering. These laws, again, they may seem small, but in many ways, because it's so difficult sometimes to be able to charge people with same-sex conduct because it happens in private, countries tend to pick on these little, laws, also which came with colonization to charge same-sex practicing people and put them in jail. Poverty is a big thing for LGBTI persons because of all the denial, not being able to finish your education, or not being able to access jobs. and other socioeconomic rights, poverty affects LGBTI communities quite disproportionately. And so they tend to work in the informal sector, which means they are more likely to work in, to be involved in sex work, for instance, or to be homeless. And when they are homeless, they are likely to be picked up. And especially during times of COVID. We've seen in Uganda, for instance, when COVID started, some LGBTI young persons were all together in a shelter, and they were raided and arrested and kept in detention for more than a month. And what happens while they're in detentions? Anal examinations, they are denied the ARVs, they are denied all kinds of things. They can't see they don't have money to bail themselves out. They cannot pay the bribes that are expected out of them. And so it just becomes a vicious circle of really continuous human rights abuse. And so really, I mean, I think at the roots of all of this is the criminalization and the intolerance that came with, the colonization. I think I'll stop there and I can contribute more.
Thank you so much, Monica, for making all these connections. I think it's very important to shed light on the interconnectedness as you did. And thank you for this, for getting us started here. And I'm sure we will pick up a lot of these aspects. We also have a first question in the Q&A. I would anyhow suppose that we continue with Adrian's input and then pick up questions from the audience and anything that comes up. So I would now like to hand over to Adrian, and to him I posed the question: from your experience as a lawyer and activist concerning LGBTIQ+ rights, who has looked into Eastern and Southern African countries' legislations and societal debates, what role does the colonial legacy or legacies of anti-LGBTIQ+ rights play today in your work? And over to you, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Mario, and thank you, Monica, for opening up that conversation. I'm working from home because today is Heroes Day. So in case of any disturbance, just next because we are working from home. Of course, I don't know which heroes are being celebrated, but at least we get to stay home for this day. So, but on the topic of the colonial legacy, of course, if you kind of reflect, if you think about us right now, speaking in English, international language, very nice language, and we can all communicate and discuss, but the very fact that as Africans, we get to communicate in English is also interesting. And also I saw the question from Pierre, speaking about the different legacies, the different languages in different countries. For example, we have what we call English-speaking Africa, French-speaking Africa, Portuguese-speaking Africa, Arabic-speaking Africa. Sometimes I ask myself, in reality, how much is Uganda an English-speaking country? It's interesting. So they call us English speaking, but the majority of this country, the majority in this country do not actually speak English, but the legacy continues, more especially among the people that we call the elites. So I'm going to look at colonial legacy in two ways. One is the temporal historical aspects of colonialism, what happened between the Berlin Conference in 1884, and then the nominal gaining of independence by African countries in the 1960s and later on, and then the concept of coloniality, which is the continuation of colonial systems way beyond colonialism as it was. So the fact that we had colonials here, they came, they stayed, they went, and then the fact that colonials continue to stay. Yesterday, I was observing the news and the King of Belgium had visited the Congo. And I was like, okay, right, here we go, here we go. I liked the pictures and how they were posing. And for me, the question was, what's happening? And someone today posted it on Twitter asking, was there no protest anywhere? No one was protesting about this with all this history of Congo. What's happened? No one is protesting. It makes me think of the concept of coloniality, the fact that colonialism continues up today, the fact that we still feel honored to be visited by the King of Belgium or the Queen of England when she came to Uganda, we are head over heels about her visit. So for me, the continued legacy, the continued aspects of colonialism, the continued way it affects us as Africans is still very important, especially in the areas around gender and sexuality. The African, at least the African elite, still sees themselves through European lenses and standards. So we ape what white people consider to be the standard, what they consider to be unacceptable. And for me, this is critical. what do we see? What are our values? What are the so-called African values? Interestingly, whereas we ape African values, whether European standards and all that, we seem to be doing it to a particular extent. The fact that we seem to be frozen in history, you see, at a point in time, the British, for example, moved away from the standards they had in the past around same-sex relations. They changed their own penal codes, they changed their own laws. We never seem to have moved beyond that. So whereas we ape white standards, we don't want to ape white standards as they change. We ape white standards up to a certain level at a particular time. That's why for us, we still continue to criminalize same-sex relations, whereas Britain already moved away from criminalization of same-sex relations. So for me, here is what affects the work that I do mainly as a lawyer and as an activist in Uganda. So the whole system is kind of riddled with colonialism. It's kind of riddled with aspects that come from the colonial legacy, that comes from British colonialism, and also in many other countries from other colonials that were here. For starters, as a lawyer, my tools of trade are colonial. Surprising. The English language is the language of court in my country, Uganda. The English law is the law that we use in my country, Uganda. Up to now, we still ape what we call English law. As a lawyer, I have to go and apply the English standards of justice. That's what I go to do every single day in court. So when I go handle a case in court, I'm handling it based on the colonial standards of justice, even up to now. Now we go to the law itself. What is the law in Uganda? You know, Uganda is a country of dualism, or maybe even of multiple. There are multiple laws that we follow here, but the laws that really override are the laws that were introduced by the colonialists. The aspect of statutory laws, written laws, which are over and beyond what we would call customary laws. So our own customs, which Monica spoke about before, are not considered as important as the laws that were imposed on us by colonialists. They still reign. They are still the laws that we use right now. Our penal code, the Uganda Penal Code, under which we criminalize canon knowledge against the order of nature, is a 1950 piece of legislation. Now, 1950 was purely colonialism. However, it goes beyond that. This penal code is actually a 1930 penal code. And this penal code comes from the Griffith Penal Code of Queensland of 1899. So it comes straight from colonialism onto Uganda and also many other African countries. And if you ask me, what were you using before 1930, we're actually using the Penal Code of Makore, the 1860 Indian Penal Code, as the direct law applicable in East Africa, both for Kenya, for Uganda, and also for Tanzania. And this is what has continued. We still continue with Makore's law, we still continue with Griffith's law. And surprisingly, like you write in our paper with Monica, we still consider this our law. These are our laws as Ugandans. We love our Penal Code. The Penal Code reflects our values as Ugandans, and that's questionable. Which values as Ugandans? No single Ugandan was consulted when Griffith was writing his law for Queensland in Australia, and we call this our own law. So whereas we are proud of our own laws, we also enforce them in a colonial law, in a colonial way. The people I have to deal with right now, even right now as we are doing police trainings, even today as I speak, my colleagues are out there doing police trainings. We're training the police. The police was trained in a colonial way. They still police the colonial way. Of course, right now, the actual colonialists might have changed from the white people to the elite who are the leaders today in today's Uganda, but the role of the police continues to be the same. So people were seen as not important, as less important, as less of humans. And these include LGBTI people are going to face the yoke of the police. The N examinations that Monica spoke about are partly as a result of the need to humiliate people are regarded as not so important in society. The arrests that we saw on the shoulders during COVID-19, the beatings, the sacrifices, the suffering that has to be imposed on LGBT people, all comes from this kind of colonial policing, which are adopted from the colonialists. And then, if the police gets you, then you end up in the judiciary. And who are our judiciary in Africa, in Uganda? Right now, there's a conversation going on around the wigs. We still wear horsehair wigs. Despite the fact that I don't think we have even 100 horses in this country, we still import wigs for judges. So you go to a judge who's putting on a wig that you don't understand. This is the guy wielding power over you. And which kind of justice is this guy going to be able to give you as an LGBTI person? The judge himself is stuck in a particular past. This is the judge that's going to give you justice. So you deal with justice, with judges, and magistrates still stuck in that perspective. So at the same time, we are very good Christians. And Muslims once in a while, and Muslims and Christians. All right, Africans. Okay, so African Muslims, African Christians speaking English, following all sorts of colonial cultures and aspects. And these are the people that are going to be giving you justice. And these are the people that are going to use religion against you as an LGBT people. That's why we see the twins. That is the evil twin. I call them the evil twins of politics and religion. So the two are fused together to come into an unholy alliance: religion and politics. So politicians feed the religious leaders feed the politicians, and either way, what we have is a cocktail of hate and even violence that arises out of this. Because people, once the religious leaders are supportive, the political leaders are supportive, then who are you as a common person not to be supportive of whatever they're supporting? So that's what makes homophobia basically to grow in this country, on this country of ours, Uganda, but also basically across the continent. So we are still reflecting justice, which values, and which everything else, even as we claim to be independent. So the independence that we're talking about doesn't exist. But also, interestingly, and this is, I'm coming towards the conclusion, interestingly, the very same groups that are espousing all these British values, all these colonial values, are the same groups that try to label LGBT people as being Western, that homosexuality is imported, that there are no homosexuals in Africa, that these people, who the so-called LGBT people, should go back to Europe, where they supposedly came from. That's interesting. When we are busy aping everything that is Western, it becomes a big problem for LGBT people, and they have to become ostracized and be sent back to Europe. At the same time, also, European countries themselves, Europeans, the current European entities have not helped matters a lot, because they also tend to buy into that colonial kind of thinking, that the kind of allies we have even today for the LGBT movement in Africa seem to also be allies that are still steeped within that colonial tradition, who don't see African activists and African LGBT people as equal to LGBT people elsewhere in the world. That's why we still get lots of advice that is largely colonial, but also lots of advice and lots of support that is largely a savior attitude. They use the savior attitude. So you are someone who needs our saving, because for us we are better off, and you guys, where are you? You are terrible. So we need to support you. We need rather to save you from whatever is happening. So for me, I would really vouch for much more respectful approaches, even from our own partners and allies from the Western countries, so that we can reduce on the so-called colonial legacy. Yes, they have more money, and that's also true that Europeans and Americans usually have more money, and usually they fund the work that we do. But at the same time, if you fund something because you believe in it, that shouldn't be the same thing as funding simply for the sake of charity, because we are all aiming at having a better world order that's devoid of colonialism and also devoid of coloniality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for giving this broad but very in-depth overview, and also pointing us to these systems that run so very deep in global Southern and global Northern contexts, and all these entanglements that you mentioned, that you sketched out, and that make my non-lawyer head explode a little bit at sometimes. But I think it's very important to look at these legacies and these histories to understand why we are in a place where we are right now with these discussions that you've both touched upon. And I see that we have already 4 questions actually from the audience. So I would like to pose, and I think, Adrian, you've also already referred to Pierre Broad's question, but I would just pose it again and give you both the chance to react to it. So Pierre says, could the speakers reflect on differences in the impact of colonialism in Africa on queer lives based on A, the legal order in the colonizer country, and B, the language / culture of the colonial country. So for example, English, French, Portuguese, Belgian, German, Spanish, etc.
Okay, let me try. I will also try. I think I've read some of the other questions as well. I mean, if it's okay. So, I believe that, in order to solve a problem is to know what the cause of that problem is. And we do know what the cause of where we are today is. It's and we can yes, blame colonization, but I think, I mean, there has been time. We've come a long way, and to be still talking about colonization, the impact thereof is kind of, not allowing for progress to happen. And there's been a decolonization project going on for years. And what does that mean for Africans? Is it inclusive enough? Does it recognize the far-reaching, the tentacles, as Adrian called them, of these systems? Or is it only the elite looking after themselves? And I think, there's been the one problem of colonization has been compounded by, the direction that our politics and our lives, our culture has taken. And I think we as activists, as academics, as human rights advocates, we need to rethink in how we do this decolonization work. I think just to give an example, here in South Africa, you heard about, the decolonizations in schools. And basically, it's about what it is that we learn as kids growing up in school. What do we learn at school? What do we learn in primary school? What do we learn in secondary school? What do we learn in university? And who is teaching it? And has there been changes in the curriculum? Has there been changes in who's teaching our kids? And do we see that manifesting itself in the adults that we are producing today? And I think that's where some of the issues are, and how, when you think about decolonization, is, first of all, you do want people to be able to challenge, the status quo. And for people to be able to challenge the status quo, is they must have the information, they must understand. When we say colonization, what does it mean for an African in South Africa, for an African in Botswana, for an African in a French-speaking country or Portuguese country? And is this colonization still happening? And a lot, around AIDS conditionality is much more of that, post-colonial colonialism continuing to happen. And so I think there is that understanding, that has to be built, and that awareness, that consciousness to understand that, when this happens, when we talk about democracy, how do we define it in a context and that we have today? Where we have, some tribes having been essentialized over others, some groups having been made much more important over others, and wishing to maintain that kind of status quo. And so how do we get out of these shackles to be able to include more than just the elite? Because I think, this is, there are intersections to all of these oppressions. You cannot tackle one and leave the other and hope to be successful. So democratization, for instance, when we are talking about constitutionalism, when we are talking about accountability and corruption, how do we see that? How do we see LGBTI persons playing a role or being impacted by decisions that are made, at that level? And how do we get, LGBTI persons participating, and being part of this, and their lives being taken into consideration? And so I think, colonialism in itself, I think it has to be understood in that way, that there has been stages of it going on, and it's still going on. And how are we dealing with it? you know, how is it impacting people in different ways? And so I think for me, education, our education system has to be revolutionized. It has to be, you know, people really need to think about all of that and unpack even the terms that we use. I remember when we were studying constitutionalism, we were doing, if I remember, I think it was the use of force by police. And we had a lecture from Scotland Yard, and this is in a university in Africa. And a lecturer from Scotland Yard teaching us that, oh, you can't use, you know, this kind of, you can't use too much tear gas, or you can't use too much. I'm like, people, police here don't even have protective gear. They don't have, there's so many things that they don't have. And we have lectures, we have people, we have different experiences, and yet the things that we learn are literally imported and brought here in Africa without any introspection or any, you know, contextualization. And I think that's where the problem is. We need to own the information. We need to create the knowledge. We need to be the one to teach our own kids about what things to appreciate, how people must be treated. When we talk about Ubuntu, it's a concept that's uniquely African, and it's beautiful in how it's described. But, you know, you don't actually have in any language or in any course where you are taught that Ubuntu is part of democratization. And yet it is, it's part of what we learn, but, you know, you don't really get that, you know, as part of the curriculum that we have. And for me, I think, you know, these are some of the things that we need to think about when we think about decolonization, you know, in the sense that it has to continue until we really appreciate who we are and understand as globalized as the world has become. I think we still need to kind of look back and see things that worked and adapt those things to today's democratic policies.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. If I could also pick up again on Pierre's question around the differences on the part of colonialism in Africa on queer lives, whether there's an actual difference. Superficial, I think there's a difference, how colonialism impacts different people in different parts of Africa, Lusophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, French Africa, and all those. Yes, there may be some difference, at least superficial. If you look at in terms of laws, for example, for those of us in English colonies, in former English colonies, we had specific laws put in place criminalizing same-sex conduct, which was a little bit different from the French colonies. Of course, Senegal eventually got its own laws, but most of the French colonies did not criminalize. But then if you look at the Lusophone countries, they also got the criminal law at some point, but the tradition from Portugal wasn't really that much of a criminalizing tradition. And so we are seeing now the process as it moves on, the process of decriminalization as it moves on. Those of us still in the Anglophone countries have to fight major battles to decriminalize. What happened in Kenya recently, but also, lucky enough, we had success in Botswana. We also had success in South Africa before. But if you look at countries like Mozambique and countries like Angola, they have been able, at least they have been able to decriminalize through parliament, which is quite interesting. A movement that decriminalizes through parliament. But also for me, it's a reflection of the very tradition of the Portuguese from before, rather than a movement that's much more effective in Angola, Mozambique than it is in Uganda or Kenya, for that matter. So for me, there's a difference at that superficial level. But for me, again, I think at that deeper level, there's really no difference in terms of how people are treated. That's the question we always ask ourselves. That South Africa, with all its nice laws, what happens to poor LGBTI people in South Africa? What about the violence we hear every single day? The rapes that we hear every other day, every other time? If you consider countries like Rwanda, for example, and the kind of silence there is around LGBT rights, and then you compare them with countries like Uganda, where we can at least speak out a little bit more, and we hear about the changes going on, you find that all of us are suffering in different ways or progressing in different ways, but because of the different dynamics at the top, it appears like there's much difference. But for me, I think it's the same thing that the African LGBT movement as a whole needs to recognize, that the differences between Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone don't actually exist in reality. We should be able to work together to make sure that all of us are at the same level as when it comes to decoloniality. Thank you.
Just maybe to add on to Adrian was talking about parliamentarians. I think I think parliamentarians, lawmakers in general, have a responsibility for protection. They make the laws. They are responsible for the budgets, oversight, and so many others. And they really go to parliament riding on the backs of their constituents. And those constituents include LGBTI persons. And so I think, at the end, we kind of gloss over about who really we want to direct our criticisms at. And I think holding all the decision makers accountable, MPs, basically accountable to everyone for the laws they make, the decisions they make that end up excluding people, the decisions they make to actually further entrench these laws that exclude communities from engagement or from civic participation, et cetera, et cetera. I think it is important that, they take note of the fact that, just sitting in parliament is really not all that they do. It's more than that. And the laws that exist in these countries is because of them. And countries go out and ratify all manners of treaties and conventions, and that will be it. And they are not enforced. In fact, on the contrary, you find some actions going against the very conventions that they sign. And that means the lack of understanding of exactly what their role as politicians are, especially those that go and talk, proliferate hate speech, incite violence against LGBTI persons. And I think those should really be taken to account at the personal level. And I know Uganda has tried to do that with Bahati with some level of success, but I mean, that was the start of something like that could happen, and hopefully more of it can happen in other countries where politicians tend to forget, why they are in the offices they are in and what they are supposed to be doing. The same applies to cabinet or other, members of the executive as they do their work. I think, in really questioning and looking at their actions to really remind them why they are there. And I think as activists and as organizations working in this decolonization project, it is our job to be able to remind them of exactly why they are there, and that we are looking at them and we are going to expose them, and not just make it visible at all times.
Thank you so much. Sorry, it took me a second to get away from taking notes to unmuting. No, thank you so much for actually delving into a couple of these questions that were posed in the Q&A section. And thank you so much to the participants to posing these amazing and important questions to our panelists. And I think I just want to pick up one aspect again, and then we can move to the other questions. And I think they do speak to each other a bit in this regard. So you both actually talked how we can maybe envision, imagine a queer decolonial movement. And you spoke about knowledge production systems, how important it is to decolonize these and make certain discussions and failures also visible on the side of the policymakers. parliamentarians, politicians, and so on. And just to push you a little bit more on this, can you maybe give us a couple of more concrete or additional ideas that you have if we were to envision and imagine a queer decolonial movement, which Sohela Sarujpal, I'm really sorry about the pronunciation, posted in the chat. I would just, love to hear from you if you can build on what you've said before.
Okay, maybe I should talk about this first. I know I have a feeling, like it has been presented here, like Sohela said, there is an awareness. We can recognize what the issue is, and we are trying to think about how to decolonize the mind, decolonize dominant culture. But for me, I think there are real challenges we have to look at before even we go to that. For me, there's this hierarchy of not necessarily hierarchy, but things that you must do at certain stages. Right now, yes, we're having these conversations at this level, but at the same time, the basic issues we are dealing with and grappling with in our own countries are issues of decriminalization, for example, just issues of stopping the arrests that are happening on a daily basis. In Uganda, even yesterday, we were having a conversation around issues of food, just the basic survival for LGBT people. Like, you need to have food, you need to be able to have shelter, issues of homelessness and other issues. And for me, yes, we can deal with all these issues at the same time, but then you cannot expect someone who's truly grappling with issues of food and basic survival to be thinking about issues of decolonization. So other aspects of the other parts of the movement can think about this, whereas other parts of the movement are busy working at the basics of decolonization and other things. At the same time, for all of us, that including those of us at the basic level, and those of us who have gone a little bit further in the movement in terms of what they're looking at, we also need to look at one key and important thing. For us to have a decolonialized movement, we have to think about sustainability of our own movements. The fact that all of us, almost all of us, are based on donor funding, the fact that we're getting our money from elsewhere, donor funding may not come with strings, like direct strings that we can all see, but all of us know that there are certain things that you must do to be in line with the donor needs. Like, they have strategies that you must follow. There are certain things that you must do because somehow those are the right things that you need to do according to what the donors are saying. So for me, without a movement that we can sustain, a movement that we can fund, for example, most of us in Uganda rarely have any single coin from the LGBT movement itself supporting the movement. That means that the whole agenda is going to be again led and driven by someone else. So for me, a real decolonized movement, a queer decolonized movement in Africa has to be a movement that is able to self-sustain itself, to be able to say, well, we're going to engage at the UN, and we are actually able to go to the UN and engage as Africans, supporting our own selves rather than being supported by others like we do right now.
Okay, just I wasn't sure if you wanted me to speak or not. Yeah, I think, there isn't one solution. I don't think there will ever be one solution. I think, the problem itself is complex enough, and it has, in a way, permeated into all facets of our lives. And that means the way to work at it is also to find those intersections. And so I think working on our own, being in a corner and being that queer movement, working on issues on your own, it's not going to work. I think, first of all, we are not just queer. We are human beings, and that means we are women, we are mothers, we are men, we are partners, we are farmers, we are in professions, we are in the church, we are everywhere. And so we need to be able to feel whole in every space that you occupy, as a citizen of whatever country or as a resident of whatever country that you live in. And so I think, having all the most NGOs being able to address human rights as an all-inclusive subject without necessarily having, women's rights feeling that they cannot include LGBTI issues in their manifestos, but feeling, feeling that we have people who are queer among us, and therefore we must work together, because all of the stuff that we deal with, for me, I think, that the address of all of these oppressive elements together intersectionally would really, really, really help. And you can see examples where it has worked. When you hear, a simple solution where people came together, and in the end, they realized just how well it worked. I'll give an example. For instance, I've worked with the African Commission many years, and when we first went to attend some of the sessions, none of the commissioners would talk to us. Literally, they would refuse and run away if they saw you. Because we were so few, people knew who you were. And so a commissioner sees you and you say hello, and they take off. And it went on like that, and would write statements which made no difference, But then we realized that even some of the NGOs were against us, which was ridiculous. We were all human rights advocates. So we, slowly we started walking into meetings and contributing, whether it was a meeting around land or some other stuff, water rights, sanitation. It didn't have to only be about LGBTI issues. It could be anything. And then, as people got to know exactly that we were interested in the fact that people couldn't get land, or people's land was being taken away from them, or just they couldn't get work, or they were poor, all of those things which affect us in different ways, but affect us anyway. And so being part of the mainstream and more general human rights movement, I think allowed people to get to know and understand what the specific struggle for LGBTI persons is. And so for me, I think the intersectional work is important to challenge every facet, and to make sure that you are visible. If there's a report that is on the death penalty, for instance, how does the death penalty impact on people same-sex orientations and gender identities? We know that there's always a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities, and most of our people live in the margins, and therefore they are more likely to be in conflict with the law than not. And when that happens, what is the outcome? And so I think, really doing research, I think knowledge is always going to be a very important instrument to be able to devise your strategy around how you deal with these things, and work around, especially working with politicians. Because, when we did that, the other thing that we did at the African Commission was to bring evidence of violations in each of the countries with very specific cases, so that nobody could stand up and say, oh, these people don't exist in my country, because we had the information. And that slowly but surely contributed to the changes where people start thinking about how certain acts by the police, by the registrar of associations affect the different lives of people. And in the end, I think you've seen now we have Resolution 275. It didn't come from nothing. It came from all that, action coming together and really getting into the intersection and getting more people, allies and partners, to come together and support the issue, the LGBTI issues.
Thank you so much for delving a little deeper into this. And I think, I'm not going to repeat this, what you said, but I think highlighting an intersectional approach, create and disseminate knowledge, make visible and actually make visible also these structures and overcome them together. I saw that Sohela has raised her hand. So I don't think we've had this before, so I'm not sure technically, but if you want, you can enable your microphone. I think you did want to ask a maybe follow-up question.
No, that was a mistake, but I've put my comment in the chat box, which is just to say that I completely agree that solidarity with other movements, especially more mainstream movements, is key to the queer movement's success.
Okay, thank you so much for that intervention and reaffirmation. I would go back to the Q&A. And I think this picks up quite nicely on where we left off now. So first of all, somebody that put the question anonymously said, thank you both for your interventions. I think it is very difficult to challenge the fact of colonial legacies and sexual policies in contemporary societies in Africa and elsewhere in global majority nation states. The question is, how can we make this knowledge well established in our societies beyond NGOs and scholarship? And this goes obviously to a lot of the things you've said before. So knowledge creation, knowledge dissemination, but maybe you can say a few words on your perspectives on how we can do this better, especially I think as scholars and activists in this room. Yeah, please go ahead. Maybe, yeah, just I think this has worked fine. Just whoever wants to speak first.
I don't know, Monica.
I have no idea. You know, I think, as I said, you know, there's understanding your own capacities and capabilities. And when we say intersectionally, that's again, really finding your niche and contributing in that space. You know, academics have had the freedom to critique and imagine, you know, and I believe our constitutions, for instance, they were the imaginations of our forefathers, of course, with a lot of input from the colonialists, but it's basically aspirations. And if we can imagine a world where we are free, where we are part of this Africa, where we are free to contribute and stand up proudly as queer persons, how would that look? And I think academics have, you know, you have the freedom with the pen or not you, they have the freedom with the pen and to be able to imagine and write that and we, you know, it can be useful. And I think, you know, more Africans being able to do that, more scholars out of Africa, you know, writing, doing research, owning the research, not just extractively taking it away into, you know, back into Europe, but really owning the research and using it in constructive ways in Africa, so that when we say inclusion, when we talk about civic participation, when we talk about democracy for queer people, what is it? How do we envision it? And I think that helps, you know, activists on the ground to have some kind of backup with research, with information that they can present to governments. You know, we have a lot of obsolete laws, for instance, that are just sitting in our statutes, doing absolutely nothing. And sometimes the police find those obsolete laws to persecute people in marginalized communities. And, you know, it's because we don't know. But I think, you know, I think, you know, just that knowledge, that research, having that being available. Namibia is going through a process right now where they're actually looking at finding all the obsolete laws with a view to scrapping them off. And I think that's a beautiful thing. If they can do it and include in it the sodomy laws, that would be fantastic. And I support them. And if we can do that for all the countries, you know, remove all the legacies of colonialism that are useless and redundant out of our system, I think, you know, it would be a start or at least a contribution to this, the work. Yeah.
Yeah, my own view, Monica, is that, of course, there's need to go beyond the knowledge, beyond the universities, beyond the NGOs, and reach out to the general public, to the MPs you spoke about, to the leaders, to the communities. So for me, I believe that every one of these aspects has its own role. The universities have their own role, the NGOs have their own role, but all of us together can work towards making sure that this kind of perspective is also known beyond us. And one of the ways how we've been trying to do this in Uganda, which I think is bearing fruit, is engaging targeted persons, talking to them about LGBT rights, talking to them about issues around colonialism and where these laws come from and the way they are being enforced, we've done this with police officers. We've trained more than 500 police officers on LGBT rights. These are senior police officers. At first it was difficult. Now it's easy that we can even invite them in a day and they come and actually sit in there and attend. We've been doing it with magistrates, because these are responsible for enforcing the laws. I've been having conversations around why people get arrested, why there's this sort of discrimination, why LGBT people are targeted. And I think from the over 400 magistrates that we invited, only 4 magistrates turned down our invitation, which for me was quite telling. We had 396 attending, and so only 4 refused to attend because they thought they couldn't be part of this conversation. Meaning that if you give an opportunity for people to come and sit in, they'll come and sit in, and we've seen a change in terms of perspectives and in terms of how they're handling cases at the moment. We're also training prosecutors, telling them, you know what, as you are sanctioning the charge of carnage against the order of nature, or the charge of doing a negligent act, like a spread infection of disease. This was a common charge used during COVID-19. As we are sanctioning this charge, just to know why people are being charged this way. It's not because they have committed a crime, it's because someone doesn't like their sexual orientation or gender identity. So this is being used to punish them. The fact they're being arrested and they're being taken through the court process is not for purposes of prostitution, but rather for persecution. So the fact of being arrested, being tried, being taken to remand is enough punishment in and of itself, even if the court does not convict. And these conversations are bearing fruit, in my view, because now you see police officers inviting you to the stations, you see state prosecutors asking you, what does this actually imply, and where should we, and why should I sanction this? And then you see magistrates releasing people on bail with light conditions, understanding where this kind of discrimination comes from. So for me, of course, where you can, like if there are countries where you can have these conversations on radio, on TV, that's good, they can be held. In Uganda, I don't think you can easily hold this conversation on TV or radio anymore. We used to do it in the past. It's right now, it's a bit difficult to do it on radio and TV, sensitizing the general population. But we've also been speaking to local council leaders, right? People right at the very basic level of society, engaging them on some of these conversations, including the origins of these laws and what these things all mean, and where and basically the implications of all these laws. So I think it's possible to continue beyond our own movements. Again, it tags into what Monica spoke about. Make sure that this is an inter-movement conversation, not just the LGBT movement, the feminist movement, the children's rights movement, and other movements also being part of all this, of this conversation.
Just to add, I think, you know, there are lots of businesses that come into our countries in Africa. A lot of them transnational, huge conglomerates that come in, and you know, they just come in and extract basically, and then they don't take any accountability for the welfare of the, you know, the people that they employ to get, you know, the money. And so, I mean, I think, you know, everybody has a responsibility, I believe. I mean, there are queer people everywhere. There will always be queer people in the workforce. You know, they in all the supply chains. And there has to be some kind of accountability by all these companies that do work. And so, I mean, a start would be for these countries just to really, really know and understand that they cannot, you know, exist without having accountability processes themselves, the protection processes themselves within the workspace. Things around just promotions or hiring processes. If someone comes, a trans person comes, what do they do? Do they lose out just because their ID might be saying their name is Monica, but on the other hand, they look like Adrian? You know, and they lose out, notwithstanding that actually they are qualified for the job. And so, you know, these are internal processes that might really sound trivial, but I think they are important as processes to ensure that queer persons can get the jobs they deserve to get and maintain them and feel safe within those spaces, knowing that they have equal opportunities, whether it's promotion or advancement or other advancement. And I think companies have a responsibility to ensure that even when they go into countries like Uganda or countries like, I'm saying Uganda because you mentioned it, you know, other countries where there are issues, you know, it's harder to be open, but at least they must take accountability for their own internal processes to do that. And I think, you know, that goes, that's a contribution, that's another way of being intersectional in your work, making sure that businesses also take accountability for their, you know, contribution towards the welfare of their employees.
Thank you so much. And I've just been smiling at a little visitor sneaking a peek in Adrian's camera. Thank you so much for these extensive answers to, I think, a very difficult and challenging question that we will all keep thinking about and keep busy with. And I think there's a lot of food for thought for everybody here. I want to move on to a question where I think it's, somehow a question, but it's also a comment by Dr. Stella Bozira, and the comment reads, if there was ever a time that the sexual and gender minority communities faced a threat, it's now. The current anti-gender, anti-rights ideologies, which are being spread by Western fascists and transnationalists to the African continent, is not new. We have been tracking them. The multiple digital computer regulatory state-run violence against queer communities is not new. Why then is the community still reactionary, even when we have tracked opposition and know the tools of trade? And I think this is a bridge to what we've been discussing so far. The question is, how can we get a step ahead of these backlashes and of these movements working against LGBTIQ plus rights and people? Monica, you wanna?
Well, again, I think knowledge, context is everything. There are different kinds of opposition, but the type that comes with religious bias, the anti-LGBTI right-wing fundamentalists are pretty strong, and I think it's about really knowing who they are. And understanding how they work. So in Uganda, for instance, and I've read this, I'm not Ugandan, I've read some of Adrian's very good researches and stuff. And so they brought missionaries, they brought young persons in big numbers. And so they have money, they are organized. And they attract other local young people with the same kind of entrapments, money. They send them back to the US and they indoctrinate. And that's about, I think that's what we need to understand and how they work, and so that we know how to then break it down and infiltrate as well, in the same way that they treat us. I think they deserve the same treatment. We need to be able to debunk all of these, populist stereotypes that they propagate. So when they come and say this is an African, or this is against the Bible or against morality, then we need to be able to ask these questions and ask them the questions: whose morality, and all of these scripts and how they history has shown us how it has been applied. I think in the same way that the Constitution is a living document, it's an organism that moves with us culturally. As we evolve, as life changes, we interpret to adapt to our ways of life. The Bible is similar in how it's applied, and there should be any difference. The same things where we say, do not take another life, those are fundamental. But all of the other things, it's all very arbitrary. And I think that's what we need to be able to do, to understand who is the opposition and what do they use to get into our midst? How do they succeed? And I know that money is big. And so Adrian was talking about sustainability earlier, and that's one way of ensuring that there's always another narrative, our own narrative, when it comes to the stereotypes and the populist movements. And so we have our narrative being put out constantly, consistently. So sustainability is important, and I mean, donors need to understand that. Donors need to understand to support the organizations that are trying to put the correct narrative. Media, and we are talking about across all media. Social media is becoming extremely important, and unfortunately, it's not all good things. And it's been used by the opposition as well. It's been used by police to entrap gay persons. It's been used, by police to arrest people. But at the same time, when we think about what happened in North Africa, social media was used to start a revolution across the region, a revolution that demanded and that was visible, that was unified. And so we can use some of these to build a community, a movement that actually gives a narrative that we own and we want to see out there. And so, I mean, I think, media in general, we just really need to get in there and make sure that we remain present. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just to maybe, Monica, to add on that, and again to feed into what you earlier said around intersectionality and around working closely together, the question that has been posed here is one of the things we need to think about, that we are not necessarily alone in this. We are also supposed to be working with others on this. That if people reflect that this anti-gender movement is not just about LGBT rights, it's also about women. So it's about so many other things that we hold dear. Then that helps to bring our movements closely together. So it's about us realizing that, it's not just about the LGBT movement, but also around, but it's also about other movements too. Then how do we work together to realize the same enemy, and then be able to work towards realizing what we want to achieve? Because we know the enemy, we've been tracking them, we know what they are doing, we know what they're up to. We just need to be able to have the solidarity to be able to reach up to where they are, because they are more powerful than us. They have more money, they have more numbers, they are also more legitimate in that sense than we are. So how can we overcome such resistance except by coming united together with other groups that can see what's actually going wrong. And that if we keep on being separate, that does not help all of it. That doesn't help us at all.
Thank you for these inputs, and they actually make me quite hopeful to listen to you. We have a few minutes left, and we have one last question in the Q&A box. I'll just read it out loud. Guru Aito says, hi, thank you all so much for your input. I'm interested in the ways in which decoloniality has been intentionally centered within LGBTIQ+ organizations outside of decriminalization campaigns. So in different contexts on the continent, and how that has changed in the organizing and or advocacy space over the last decade. Has it become a stronger refrain? What is the core part of the strategy from the onset? And has it helped or harmed the various movements to frame the fight using these terms?
Wow.
The big question towards the end that I think you are the perfect people to actually answer. So I'm very much looking forward to hear from you.
Monica, I go fast again.
You take it.
Wow, this is a tough one, really. But for me, my own perception around the decoloniality movement, it's not a new movement. Certainly, it has been there. But I also think, and also it has been underlying a number of movements, basically pro-LGBT movements over time. But I think to have it much more deliberately included is, I think, much more recent, that we are trying to use it much more deliberately, much more recently. And whether it has harmed the various movements to frame the fight using these terms or not, I don't think so. For me, I think it's more of it also helps to build allies across board, like been talking about that. If all of us realize that we have the same things that we are fighting about, then I think it helps to make the movement much more broad-based. So it's no longer just about LGBTI people, it's also about other persons. Everyone realizes that, okay, what we are fighting about is not just about, it's not just about sex, like usually they state it to be. It's much more than this. It's much more about humanity. It's much more about African. It's much more about dignity of the African as a person, and that we're all involved in the same broader fight. So I think it's something that is useful, and it's not something that we should do, but we should continue to have a conversation around it and continue to use it as one of the strategies, as part of the different things that we do within the African context.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Adrian. I think, at the beginning, really, I wasn't there, but I think I'm close. I'm old enough to claim, some of the stuff at the beginning, at least in my own country. I think, you start small and you are few, and so the ideas are also small and few. And you deal with the bread and butter issues, but just especially if you're in criminalized countries, you're dealing with avoiding arrests, getting a job and so on and so forth. And then those may actually not, on the face of it, they are not decolonization issues, but they are. They are. But, we did not frame them in that way. But like all movements, you become a little bit more knowledgeable, more aware, sophisticated, and you read and you realize actually this is where things stem from, and you expand how you address and how you build your strategies, realizing that by starting from the top, you cannot win by starting from the top. You have to start from the bottom, right? Bottom up means working with the people and going up to confront those at the top, who are usually the few that hold the reins and the power. So it is all about power in the end, and how that power is wielded over and within certain institutions. And so how then can you get a little bit of that power yourself as a movement? to empower yourself and empower your people to be able to challenge some of these notions. And I think it has been useful, and of course, you know, it's not perfect. I don't think anything is perfect, and there are flaws, because we are also flawed as human beings, and we have needs that sometimes go beyond the movement, and you know, and that's how life is. But I think it has been useful in the sense that, you know, it has allowed us to actually go beyond the bread and butter issues and address the core issues that are so entrenched in our institutions, in our ways of life, in our cultures, that are really defining discrimination, persecution, and exclusion. And those are the core things and how they came about. And so this idea of decolonization, and understanding that it's not just the actual colonization of the white men coming into the country, but the continuous system entrenchment of systems that take away power, that extract, and that hold down, that persecute. And so I think it has been useful, but you know, you of course have to realize that you have to work through the intersections, and contextually things are different. You know, the applications of the laws are different. The people themselves are different. Culturally, religiously, even geographically, we are different. And so I think context matters in this instance. You know, where how you discuss and where you discuss, with whom you discuss these issues.
Beautifully said. I am in awe of our discussion today, and in awe of you for putting it that way, and building this beautiful bridge towards the end, which leaves us on a hopeful note. And I think to, you know, take with us to tackle, attack from different angles, to deconstruct colonial, neo-colonial, post-colonial continuities of oppressive systems and powerful systems that run very, very deep, be they laws, policies, norms, or practices. And I can just thank you again so very much, Monica and Adrian, for your time and your headspace and your input. And thank you so much to all the participants for being here and contributing really great questions. And with that, we are not yet concluding the session, but I will just hand over to Justice real quick, who will introduce the next session that will happen in July, because we're just at the top of the mountain, or at half of the session, so whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
Hey, Justice.
Can you hear me, guys? Oh, okay. Yes. Our next event is going to be on the 11th of July. And we'll be having a speaker called Dr. Mparamoto, and he will be speaking on theorizing violence within LGBTIQ plus relationships. So the conversations are still ongoing, and thank you very much for this engaging conversation today.
Yes, thank you so very much, Adrian and Monica, and thanks to the whole team. And yeah, I will just close the session now, and please have a look at the comments. There's a lot of thank yous coming in, and applauses, and
thank you,
gratitude.
Thank you, Mariel. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thursday.